To discuss China's economic growth, let's turn to Benjamin Cavender. He's the managing director at China Market Research Group. And Benjamin, President Xi had some words of reassurance, as we just showed, saying China will hit the GDP target and that China will remain the biggest engine of world economic growth. I want to get your take on his comments and what we just heard from Dai Kai about this trade resiliency that we're seeing in the November numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think she's sending a very clear statement to the U.S. and the coming Trump administration that regardless of whatever policies the U.S. might try to put in place, that China is intending to maintain the growth trajectory that they've had this year, and they've done a pretty decent job, frankly, of navigating a pretty tough 2024 and sort of carrying that over into 2025. And so I think the key point out of all of this, since we were just talking about exports, is that China really saw most of its growth this year coming from exports and is really looking for exports to be probably a large part of the backbone for growth in 2025. Now, the big risk has been that exports to the U.S. somehow become untenable because of tariffs, but the reality is that China doesn't have nearly as much exposure to the U.S. market as it did 8 years ago, and has spent the last 8 years really focusing on building out these relationships with the global south that we just heard about. And so I think actually China is in quite a good position going forward.
Yeah, it's kind of inoculated itself moving forward in a sense. In January, as you mentioned, just around the corner, it's a huge milestone in China. Back in 2015, the government came up with an ambitious plan, the Made in China 2025, the goal trying to be competitive and innovation and really spearheading work in high technology sectors. It's been kind of a remarkable transformation, a lot of ground covered in the last decade. What's your assessment?
I have to say you should be calling it a success. I mean, anybody that walks around a city like Shanghai and looks at the cars on the road, looks at the level of integration of high-tech software and conveniences into daily life, would have to say that China has been successful at becoming a true driver of innovation. I think anybody saying anything counter to that probably at this point really doesn't have a good grasp of what's going on the ground here. So I think China's really sort of reached that target. I think the big challenge now, though, is we have a tremendous number of young white-collar workers either expecting to enter the workforce or having just entered the workforce and finding that, yes, the economic environment right now is slower. And so when we look at where future growth is going to come from beyond exports, it's how do you get jobs for those people and how do you build consumer confidence? And I think that's the big question mark right now.
Yeah, so let me ask you about the monetary policy loosening up. How will that change things moving into 2025, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is I don't think anybody has a firm grasp of exactly what is going to happen or what form it's going to take. My sense is that given China's essentially been in a deflationary environment, and you really have consumer confidence at a sort of a kind of a fairly low point right now, we're probably going to see a couple of things. I think we'll see continuing pressure on lending rates to get them down, especially as related to home purchases, because one of the key things that's dragging on the economy right now is just consumer perception of the value of their family wealth because of the paper value of their properties. And then two, I think we'll probably see something happen maybe with lowering of taxes for individuals, but also lowering of corporate taxes to really try and make it easier for a lot of smaller businesses, A, to survive, but B, to grow and start hiring again. I think that's where we'll see probably a lot of the action going forward.
You know, we were talking about Made in China just a short time ago. The government is rolling out a new plan that would give domestically manufactured materials a 20% price advantage for government contracts. That's going to give domestic producers kind of a leg up. Talk to us about how that might shake out moving forward.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to watch, I think, in the context of how China is currently negotiating and having discussions with the EU and other nations or trading blocs, because it does also paint China as protectionist to some degree, which I don't think they want. But at the same time, I think from a policy standpoint, China's been very clear that they want to promote this dual economy idea and really promote the idea of developing domestic manufacturing, domestic brands for sale into the domestic market, especially if they find the US and Western Europe a little bit locked off. So I think this will be a lifeline for a lot of Chinese businesses, though frankly speaking, most of those businesses were getting those contracts anyway. So I don't know how much of a difference it's necessarily going to make.
Yeah, interesting point. We started off the broadcast by talking about the 1+10 dialogue and President Xi kind of asking for changes in the global economic governance. This has been kind of an issue for China for some time. Do you see any movement there moving forward?
I think this year has been such an interesting year because there have been 70 or 80 elections around the world with new leaders coming into power. So it's been a huge year of change, and I think a lot of the bilateral discussion between nations still needs to happen, and then a lot of the discussion that happens through these various international organizations is still sort of ongoing. So I like to think when there's a lot of change like that, there is opportunity. I think China has taken on the mantle of being a little bit more vocal in a lot of these global discussions and sort of being a little bit more of a standard bearer for the idea of interconnectedness and free trade, especially at a time when the U.S. is sort of moving in a little bit more of a protectionist manner. So that can only be good. But I think there's still a lot of misperception about China and their goals. And so they're going to have to be more discussions and more negotiation, I think, to get everybody to a happy place.
Benjamin Cavender, some great insights. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.